In this demonstration, I will be getting the AWS CLI, the command line interface, up and running on the Windows platform. And I'm going to do this on an on-premises Windows computer. But really, whether it's a virtual machine running in the cloud, running on-prem, a physical computer, it makes no difference. But what is the same and consistent, of course, is that the CLI allows us to work at the command line to work with AWS resources, to either deploy or manage them. You could even put some of those statements in scripts to perhaps automate the management of AWS resources. Either way, let's get started. Here in my web browser, I've navigated to aws.amazon.com/CLI. So we've got the command line interface screen here, where on the right, we can download and run the 64-bit Windows installer, which is a link. I'm going to click to follow that link and download the installer to my local downloads folder. And then when I run that downloaded Microsoft installer package, because it comes in the form of an MSI for Windows, it starts the setup wizard. So this is the CLI version 2, V2. I'm going to click Next to continue on with this. I will accept the license agreement, of course, after having read it, and then I'll click Next. I'm going to accept the default installation location or path, so I'll click Next, and then finally, I will click Install. Okay, once that installation has completed, I'll click the Finish button. Now, if I open up a command prompt on that machine where I completed the CLI installation, I can just test out that it knows that it's installed by typing AWS. And it knows I'm talking about AWS, the Amazon Web Services CLI. I can issue commands like AWS help to learn about the next level commands after typing in AWS. So when I go further down to the available services section, it's alphabetized, and this would be the next level command set I would issue or type in after typing in AWS. For example, EC2, if I want to work with EC2 compute services. So, for example, AWS EC2, and then I could issue the help command yet again to get the next level help after typing in AWS EC2. Like attach-volume, if I want to attach an EBS volume to an EC2 instance. So we know that it's here and it's ready to go because it's recognized at the command prompt. Here in the AWS console, if I click on my username in the upper right, I can then click on Security Credentials. Why am I doing this? Because down here, I can go to Access Keys, where I have access and secret key pairs that I can use to authenticate to AWS from the CLI. I've already created an access and secret key and downloaded it, although notice here in the console, only the access key is shown. You need to download and save and back up the file when you create this key pair, the access key and secret key, for future reference. So for example, here is my Excel spreadsheet that I downloaded at the time I created the access key and secret key combination. I'm going to go ahead and type AWS configure help so I can get help on how to use the AWS configure syntax in order to work with my AWS credentials here in the CLI. So as we go down through the help, it discusses using the AWS access key as well as the secret access key, which we've discussed. And then we have a list of available commands that we would use following AWS configure. So for instance, I'm just going to type AWS configure all by itself, and I'll press enter. So the first thing it says is, what is your access key? So I will supply that. We saw that in the AWS console as well as in the downloaded key file. I'll press enter, and then I'm asked for the secret key. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to paste it in here and press enter. It asks for a default region name. When you're in the console, you can click on the region selector in the upper right next to your username. Here you'll have a listing of the regions spelled out, but you'll also have the short version, such as US-East-1. So I'm going to specify US-East-1, and I'll press enter. I'll accept the default output format, which is JSON, and I'll press enter. If I were then to type AWS configure list, I would have a reference for both the access key and the secret key that I entered. Notice some settings like the region here are stored in a config file in my home directory, so a tilde, in .aws, which is a folder in a file called config. So if I change directory to that path here in Windows and do a dir, here we've got a config file and a credentials file. If I run Notepad against the config file, it shows my region that I've set as US-East-1, And if I run Notepad against my credentials file, I've got my access key and my secret key set here. So we should be authenticated now here in the CLI. One way to verify this is simply to try to work with AWS resources in our account. For example, if I were to run AWS S3 API, because what I want to do ultimately is get a list of S3 buckets. So after that, I'll put in a space and list dash buckets. I'll go ahead and press enter. It returns a lot of the details about my buckets, such as the name of the bucket and the creation date. Now, if all I want are names, I can just press Control-C to quit that, use the up arrow key to bring up that previous command, but at the end of it, I'll add a space and dash dash query, and in double quotes, I'll put in buckets, open close square bracket, because it's a collection of buckets that will be returned from this command, and then I'll put in .name, because that's the property I want returned, and I'll close my double quotes. So what we're doing is just doing some client-side filtering of the output of that command. And so what this results in, of course, is a list of only S3 buckets. And we could only have gotten this list by being authenticated to our AWS account.